know we're not htmx conference. Okay, we're not. This is Big Sky DevCon, but we happen to have a core maintainer of htmx coming up next, okay? Freelance developer, used to be a lead dev over at Washington Post, Alexander. Where's Alexander? All right, there he is. Yeah, nice. So it's going to be awesome, and he's going to be talking about htmx. Hey, I'm very excited. I'm very excited, too.
Appreciate it. Hey, everybody. Little insider tip. They never asked me to see these slides, so anything could be on them. Fortunately, what's on them is the talk that I said I would give. All right, so I'm Alex. I'm one of the core maintainers of htmx, and this is the life and death of htmx. Most of you probably know what it is, but just a quick recap. On the screen, we have a button. It says Get Users. We can imagine that when you click this button, it will get you a list of users. So that's what that looks like in HTML. And htmx makes it really easy to enable that experience. So you just add these two attributes. Say hx_get users means when you click it, go to the /users route. And hx_swap means replace the outer HTML, which means the button, with everything once the thing comes back. So the user clicks, it says get to the server responds with a list of stuff, and then the button becomes a list of stuff. That's it. That's htmx. There's a little more to it, but that's the core idea. So the title of the talk is a reference to a talk by Gary Bernhardt called The Birth and Death of JavaScript. And in it, he kind of describes like where JavaScript came from, what it accomplished, and kind of posits a hypothetical future where JavaScript eventually becomes a compile target and kind of creates the seeds for its own obsolescence. And so I'm going to do basically the same thing, but with HTMX. Talk about where HTMX came from, and then how HTMX can kind of push the standards of the web forward. And if you're wondering why I changed birth to life, by the time I realized that I had done that, it was too late to change the title of the talk. So what I'm going to describe here is the pattern by which things end up in HTML. So basically, HTML is a set of core functionality that is available in every single browser, and developers can use JavaScript to extend that core functionality. So as that happens over time, turns out that a lot of developers do not have original ideas, or more charitably, they have lots of versions of the exact same idea. So as we continue to make the same idea over and over again, we kind of decide what works, what doesn't, and with kind of the law of large numbers, arrive at what is a good thing that should be in HTML. And then the best, most important functionality that arises from the large community of developers, those things we pull into the standard, we extend the standard, and then now we have a new baseline for what should be in HTML. So that's kind of the way that progress happens, and I'm going to talk about how HTMX specifically can be part of that cycle. And this has happened many, many times in the past. So jQuery pretty famously had this, made it much, much easier to find things in the DOM. And eventually, the people who maintained the DOM said, we should have query selector. And now you can just use CSS selectors to get things from the DOM. Same with many, many reimplementations of the I click a thing, it gets bigger. I click it again, it gets smaller. And we said, OK, well, let's just have a details element, and that'll just be there. And you can style that, and it can look like whatever you want. So this cycle repeats itself many, many times. All right. So this is a brief history of partial page replacements, which is essentially what HTMX does. So in 1999, an early version of the XML HTTP request API ships with Internet Explorer 5. And you can see it's not the easiest thing to use. You have to open a socket, and then you have to wait for you have to do a callback for when it finishes. But it's there. It's a thing that lets you do an HTTP request outside of the confines of HTML. In 2006, jQuery says, we could make this a little bit easier, and introduces AJAX, which is now basically a name for we take a thing, we make a request, we replace the thing with what came back. And you can see also here that what jQuery has done is say there are a couple core things we need to do every time. We need to specify the method, we want to say where we're going, and we don't need to be fiddling with the internals. We can just describe that declaratively and then make it easier for the user to use. So you can see the interface keeps getting better. Then in 2016, the first version of Intercooler.js was released, which Karsten mentioned earlier was the precursor to HTMX. And it says, hey, all this stuff we're doing here, we keep doing that a lot. Let's just put it on the thing itself. And we'll say, hey, now we're posting to this thing, and do all this jQuery stuff every time, because it turns out that we need to keep repeating this many, many times. And then finally, now we have htmx, which kind of cleans up that interface, removes the jQuery dependency, because intercooler was a jQuery extension, and says, all right, here you go. You can now do AJAX from an attribute. And I think this is pretty close to the platonic ideal of what this interface should be. And this has worked very well. This htmx is the second fastest growing JavaScript front-end framework. So that's pretty cool. And again, as I mentioned, we keep iterating on this interface. We're like, oh, we have to do this same series of actions many times. Let's keep making that thing easier until we arrive at kind of the right idea here. So how do we get this on the standards track? We have a clear pattern. We want to take a thing in the DOM, make a request, replace the thing with what came back. Let's get that in HTML. And I have 3, I think, relatively simple ideas for how to do that, and they map up very well with the stated motivations for htmx on the web page. So I'm going to start with why should only get and post methods be available? And if you're not familiar with this problem, the top 2 things are a form that is legal in HTML, which is a form that says method get or method post. These are 2 HTTP methods. But there are other HTTP methods that just don't work. So if you do put or delete or patch, it just ignores you and does a GET request. We should change that. And if this has ever annoyed you, you're not alone. This Stack Overflow question has been asked like 10 times. The first example is from 2013, 2011, 2018, 2020. This is so obvious. Like people say, oh, there's a method. I should be able to do put and delete. And then they continually run into the wall that you cannot, in fact, do that. So forms should be able to put and delete. That's my first big idea. And the reason that these HTTP methods matter is because the methods say different things. They mean different things. So this is an example of like a very basic HTML or HTTP resource, which is just like a users. Like let's say you have a list of users, and you want to be able to show those users and do things to those users for the people who are visiting your website. So if you get /users, you're telling the server, I want to get all of the users. And if you add another slash and say what user, user 123, you're saying I want to get user 123 specifically. Now, if you want to modify those resources, so if you want to change something about user 123, you need to do a put request, because a put request says, I want to replace that user with this new data. This is different from a post request, which says, I just want you to make a new thing. And if that thing happens to be there already, fine, whatever. But a post request is for making a new thing, and a put request is for adding, for updating a specific thing. It might create a new one if it's not already there, but these 2 things have very different semantics. And delete is an entirely different thing. Delete says that should no longer exist. So there are lots and lots of ways that developers work around, including these semantics, by saying, hey, well, there's another form that says, there's another input that says, this is a post request, but do a delete. But you shouldn't need to do that, because it's all right here. And this matters because the browser, or whatever your HTTP client is able to do different things for you based on what you've described that your method is supposed to do. So a post request cannot be repeated, which is why every time you refresh a page after submitting a form, you get that scary message that says, you may be resubmitting the form. Are you sure you want to do that? And then like the user freaks out. It's like, I don't know. If you had a put request, you can keep repeating that. The fancy HTML word for this is idempotent. I don't know that anyone's ever said that out loud. There's no agreed upon pronunciation. I looked it up. But what that means is that you can retry it many times and you'll get the same outcome. So if I keep telling the server, hey, replace user 123 with the contents of my form, no matter how many times you do that, if the contents of the form don't change, the server's supposed to do the same thing every time. Same with a delete request. It doesn't matter how many times you say, delete this guy. If you send that 3 times, the outcome should always just be, delete this guy. So the browser can retry those things based on you describing with HTTP semantics what the browser is supposed to do. And there's another practical reason that I don't see a lot of people talk about here, which is that programming with HTTP methods used semantically is much, much easier. Because the way that we describe what an HTTP server should do is often with a router. This is an example from Express.js, and I kind of formatted the column so that you can see, like, I'm saying, hey, here's what the method is on the left side: post, put, delete, get, etc. The yellow bit is the root itself. And then I also describe different levels of permissions for all of these things. And then I say which function should handle the actual successful response to the HTTP request. And I want to zoom in specifically on, this is an app that I maintain that manages outdoor trips for a college. And one thing you do with this app is add or create trips that other people might join to go on. And if you post a trip, that's creating a new trip. But if you put to a specific trip ID, you're updating a trip that already exists. And these two things have different permissions, because any leader in the Outdoors Club is allowed to create a trip, but you're only allowed to edit the trip that you created. So by describing these things with different HTTP methods, I'm able to, in the router, declaratively describe in a way that's pretty easy to read, even if you're not familiar with Express.js itself, what permissions are on each of these routes and how these routes do different things. This is much, much easier than trying to put like an if statement inside the post that's like, if input method equals delete, then do this, if this, because there's just a lot less room for error. And if you're noticing that a theme of this talk is that doing things declaratively makes them easier to maintain and understand over a long period of time, that's not an accident. This is Django. Python fans will be familiar with URL patterns, which is basically the same thing. You describe a route, and then you have an object, or like a class, and that class has methods on it, like post, get, delete, etc. I don't like this as much as the Express.js way of doing it, but it accomplishes essentially the same thing. And the more surface area you give to the application to describe your application at this level, the more ability that you have to kind of audit it and make sure you don't make mistakes. This is one that's in Rust. I wrote this. This is a macro. And again, you can see it's almost an identical structure. There's some affordances made to Rust's kind of weird type semantics and macros and whatnot. But I'm saying the same thing. So even if you don't know what this code, like how it works, which you can't because it's a macro that I wrote, you can still see that, that it's saying, here's a method, here's a URL, here's who's allowed to access this URL, and here's the function that handles fulfilling that particular request. So this has been tried a number of times, first in 2010, and then there's an open but inactive GitHub issue saying, hey, why can't forms do this? And there's been a couple objections raised. This is kind of my attempt to resolve all of the objections that I've seen when this has come up in the past. And I want to emphasize, the fact that this hasn't happened yet isn't really anyone's fault. It's really, really hard to add things to HTML or any of the web standards, because everything that we agree to add to the web standards, we are on the hook for supporting essentially for eternity. So it's really good that we take our time to get these things right. And the need for this thing has been questioned in the past. And so one of the things that I hope the resurgence of interest in htmx and other similar technologies, Turbo, PJAX, whatever, demonstrates that this is still a very, very clear missing hole in HTML. That's something that we do have the capacity to fix. All right, number 2. Why should only links and forms be able to make HTTP requests? This is one that the htmx website gets a fair amount of criticism for, because people say that, well, these are the semantic elements for doing things, so we should be able to, we shouldn't be just willy-nilly putting HTTP requests on random HTML elements. And I agree with that, actually. My only addendum to this would be we should be able to do it on buttons. So links, forms, and buttons. That's it. They really don't need to be anywhere else. You can style links, forms, and buttons however you like. You can make them look to the user like whatever they expect, but you should be able to put them directly on buttons. Now, buttons. Here's a logout button. And don't shout it out, because we're not equipped to take questions, but just ask yourself, how would you implement a logout button? And there's not actually an obvious way for this extremely common HTML activity. If you wanted to do it in pure HTML with a post request, probably what you would do is wrap the button in a form. But I'm not submitting a form. I just want to take an action. I just want to log out. And the idea that we have to wrap buttons in forms, it kind of makes people feel like they're doing a hack, and then kind of, oh, well, if I'm already doing a hack, I might as well just do it in JavaScript, or do a GET request with a link, or just do there's no obvious supported kind of pattern for doing this. And you should be able to specify clearly and concisely what a button does. Hey, button, delete this thing when it gets clicked. Great. The aforementioned outdoor trips program that I'm in charge of uses this pattern very frequently. Up here, the person in green, that is Carson. He's the leader of the trip. And he can choose to make me a leader of the trip by clicking Make Leader. And the way this button works, it's not a form. It's just a button that issues a put request to the list of leaders and says, hey, add this person to the list of leaders. And then when you click it, it makes you a leader, and it returns a new button that says, hey, when you click this red button now, remove them from the list of leaders. Again, none of this is like a form. I'm not filling out any paperwork. I'm just doing a thing and then inserting the response from the server. So if you should not be wrapping these things in forms. And when you don't have to wrap them in forms, you get to do these nice patterns with forms, where you have the button do a different thing, even though both of these buttons are in the form. So the save button is a regular submit, and it will submit the form and update the profile. But the cancel button is just a regular, just issues its own GET request, independent of the form, and just like returns to the non-editable view of the form. And if you had to wrap that button in a form, then you'd have two forms inside. This would just it gets confusing really, really fast. So to steal one of Carson's lines from his Grug Brain essay, you should just be able to put the thing on the thing where it should be. And what's nice about this, I think, is that it turns HTML, so people say, well, you're not using semantic HTML, right? Oh, you've made this div usable. Now you have to add an ARIA role that says what the thing does. But if the button can do a thing that the div can't, then everyone will just use the button. And so you've accomplished what you actually want, which is getting people to use HTML properly so that screen readers can use it, so that websites are accessible to a much wider variety of people. But you've done that by making the thing more useful. So rather than being a list of rules that you have to memorize, it's functionality that you have access to, and then people will use it. OK. Some more details. Again, just my attempt to address what I think are some of the ambiguities that would happen if you do this. But basically, buttons should have action and method attributes that operate identically to the way they operate on forms. And you have to explicitly specify how that interacts when the button is in a form, how it interacts with type equals button versus type equals submit. But I think that these are solvable problems, and the surface area, the API surface area that you have to modify is very, very small. So I also think this is quite doable. All right, last one. Why should you only be able to replace the entire screen? So why, when you do a form request right now, the whole screen gets wiped, and then you replace it with what comes back, or in many cases, you just redirect to a different thing, so then you're kind of doing this thing. So yeah, I agree with this. HTML should be able to specify partial page updates. Now, a lot of people don't know that we're like 90% of the way there on this one, because a link has a target attribute. And the target attribute has a couple keywords, or any iframe. So this is just like a regular Open Maps embed. And if you have a link on a page, you can target this embed and have those links change what's inside the iframe. So that is a partial page update. You're saying, hey, this little bit of the page, this iframe, I'm controlling that with these links. There is a framework called htmx that basically takes this idea and generalizes it. And to be honest, I think that this started out as essentially a troll, and then the person who made it realized it's a pretty good idea. And it's been updated a couple times since then. And all it does is says, hey, here's an iframe, and when you target this iframe, I'll just take what you put in here and yeet it into the DOM somewhere else. That works. It works really, really well. They also have a little bit of a ding on HTML here, or on HTMX, where they say, oh, well, naturally, we can only do this with links and forms, because those are semantic. To which I would just say, and buttons. You should be able to do it with links and forms and buttons. Also, while this is like a little bit of a ding, links and forms are the only things that support targeting iframes. So yeah, sure, it's semantic, but again, it's what they have access to, which is what makes the paradigm of HTMZ work. HTMZ, though, is burdened by the fact that because they have to target the iframe, they can't say where the replacement should go in the target element. They have to do it with this like page anchor after the hash, the blue bit there. And what they really want to do, and what we should be able to do in HTML, is just target the thing. And that's really all you have to do for partial page updates. Just make this. Many libraries have kind of coalesced on the jQuery-like idea that this should be a CSS selector. So just let target be a CSS selector. And then on a link, a button, or a form, and just say, hey, replace what the CSS selector is, what the response is with whatever the CSS selector is. Yes, so some details to this. For backwards compatibility reasons, you probably have to say, ignore, like if there's an iframe that for some reason has a name that is a valid CSS selector, that should probably take precedence. It's very important to not break backwards compatibility with existing web pages, but I think that this is very doable. So just some ideas for this that will hopefully make it into an HTML standards proposal in the near future. All right, conclusions. I did it. I addressed most of these things. The one thing that doesn't get addressed is why should only click and submit events trigger actions. This is basically for scripting purposes, and it's not what I'm interested in for the purpose of this talk. I want to know how HTML itself can be a more descriptive hypertext. And yeah, so these are the proposals. And one of the reasons that I care about this so much is that the HTML standard is the baseline that everyone has access to. And if you write something that is in pure HTML, that thing will last as long as browsers are around. And we have a pretty safe bet that browsers are going to be around a very long time. So there is an entire category of web pages, government services, SaaS companies, just like the internals of some random Cisco-like place where you just need this thing to work forever and you don't want to have to be maintaining it in an ongoing manner. And all of those things, if we just very, very slightly increase the expressive power of HTML, we would be able to say build them in a language that more or less never goes obsolete. And I think that's a very, very powerful concept. And again, I want to emphasize, because that thing never goes obsolete, it's really, really important to get every single one of the details right. So this talk should be understood as a way of starting the conversation. How do we take these ideas that many libraries, htmx included, have coalesced around, and how do we get those into a thing that everybody has access to for as long as HTML remains the most important document format in the world? That's it. Thank you very much.